Hello BioB students, welcome to another session. As always, Dr. Daniel Andrews with you to take you through the session. So today what we're looking at is quite varied. So we'll start off by looking at the ways multiple molecules in a sample or in one place interact together. So the main example we're going to be looking at is how different water molecules come together and sort of what holds them together. And we call this the intermolecular forces, basically meaning the forces between different molecules. We'll also compare the strength of these intermolecular forces to the strength of true chemical bonds, which are referred to as intramolecular forces, meaning within one molecule. We'll then have a look at the types of energy that atoms possess. These include kinetic energy and also potential energy. Then we'll look at some laws that govern how gases behave, in particular Boyle's law, which can actually help explain how we move the oxygen and carbon dioxide in and out of the body as well. And the last section we'll look at the relationship between solutions. So how can you have one component dissolving in another component? And the main example we'll be looking at there is dissolving salt, NaCl, which is polar, in another polar solution, which is water. We'll also see that once a certain amount of salt has been added into a certain volume of water, the solution will become saturated, which basically means no more of the salt can actually be dissolved. So we'll look at what happens there. And we'll also touch on osmosis, which is basically something that describes how a solution is able to move through a semi-permeable membrane. And in this context, a cell is also a semi-permeable membrane. So osmosis allows water to move in and out of cells, for example. Okay, so for the first section, we're going to be focusing on the different types of forces in terms of those that are intramolecular and intermolecular forces. So before we get going, let's look at the difference between the start of each of these words. So we've got intra and inter. So the difference between intra and inter will basically tell us what type of force we're dealing with. So intra basically means within. So you can think of these as the forces within one molecule. So we've already looked at the forces within molecules that hold them together, and we call these chemical bonds. So for example, water is held together by covalent bonds because the electrons are being shared between the hydrogen and oxygen atoms. But we're now looking at this new type of force that we haven't seen before, intermolecular. So the inter basically means between. And these are the forces between two or more molecules. So the main one of these we'll be focusing on is called the hydrogen bond. Its name is a little bit deceptive because it's not a true chemical bond. It's an association between two different molecules. Okay, so this will be really key to this section, the difference between intra and inter. So make sure you got your head around that before we continue. Okay, so you can see the summary of intramolecular forces here. So as I said on the previous slide, intramolecular means within, and it's the forces within one molecule. So an intramolecular force are the true chemical bonds that are basically connecting the atoms within one molecule or compound. So when you're talking about intramolecular forces, you're just talking about one individual molecule. So the forces that would hold together such a component would be either covalent bonds or ionic bonds. So these are the bonds that hold together individual components within one molecule. So here we can see an example of the covalent bonds that are holding together the water molecule. So we've got two covalent bonds represented by these two black lines attaching the oxygen to the two hydrogens. So as well as being called covalent bonds, we can call these intramolecular forces because they're the forces within one molecule that's holding it together. So the new one that we're looking at today is the intermolecular forces. And these are the forces between two different components or two different molecules. We can think of the intermolecular forces as attractive forces. So it's what holds two molecules closer together. Okay? So if they weren't attracted together, they wouldn't be held together. So we've got these attractive forces that are holding the multiple molecules together. So a key characteristic of the intermolecular forces is that they are weaker than intramolecular forces. This is because they're not true chemical bonds. So that means they're not as strong at holding the two components together. So there are a few different types of intramolecular forces, including hydrogen bonds, dipole-dipole interactions, and van der Waals interactions. But for our purposes in this lecture, we're only going to be looking at hydrogen bonds because these ones are the most important to what we're going to see in this course. For example, they're responsible for holding the two strands of a double-stranded DNA helix together, and they're also responsible for some of the interactions that hold proteins together. Okay, so we'll be focusing on the hydrogen bonds. Don't let the name fool you though, because even though it's called a hydrogen bond, it's not a true chemical bond. So a little bit confusing there. A hydrogen bond is weaker than a covalent bond or an ionic bond. But it is the strongest type of the three intermolecular forces. So out of the dipole-dipole, van der Waals, and hydrogen bonds, the hydrogen bond is the strongest intermolecular force. So essentially, you can think of the intermolecular forces as the attractive forces that are holding multiple molecules together. So the example we have here is a combination of water molecules within a water droplet. So obviously within that water droplet is going to be a huge number of individual water molecules. And basically there's these hydrogen bond forces that are holding those water molecules quite close together. So you can see in the picture here that the water is actually beading, forming this spherical shape. Can you think why the water might be doing this? Is the water more attracted to other water molecules within that drop, or is it more attracted to the leaf? Well, if it was more attracted to the leaf, it would actually be spread out across the whole leaf. Whereas because it's forming this bead shape, basically that's as a consequence of these intermolecular forces that are holding the water molecules quite close together. So you can actually see evidence of the intermolecular forces happening here because the water molecules within that drop are actually more attracted to each other than they are to the leaf, hence the beading. So an example that might help you to see the difference between these intramolecular forces and intermolecular forces, say if you've got a group of people, you can think of the intermolecular forces as the handshakes between that group of people. But they're the handshakes where the people don't let go. So essentially, they shake hands and they stay attached. Whereas the intramolecular forces, they would be the forces that are basically holding one person's body together. So if you can think of the connections between the arms and legs to the torso as a chemical bond, they would be holding the whole body together. Okay? So we've got the intramolecular forces holding the one body together, whereas the intermolecular forces are the forces that are going to allow multiple people to attach together via those handshakes. So let's make it really clear what the difference between these two is then. So in your mind, what is an intramolecular force? So simply, the intramolecular forces are the chemical bonds that hold together one single molecule. So you can think of intramolecular as being within one molecule. What about intermolecular forces? What do they represent? Well, these are the non-chemical bond forces between multiple molecules, and they're not as strong as true chemical bonds. Which is the main one of these intermolecular forces that we're going to be focusing on? So we're going to be focusing on the hydrogen bond, which is actually what allows the water molecules within the water droplet to actually be attracted to each other. So this goes back to a slide we saw in an earlier session, just to realize why atoms behave the way they do. So remember, atoms actually want to form attachments together to become more stable. So these attachments are the chemical bonds, and we're now giving them this extra definition of also being intramolecular forces. So remember, the atoms are forming these chemical bonds to try and get the right number of electrons in their valence shell to be stable. Satisfying the octet rule and having 8 valence electrons is where the atom will be the most stable. So remember, it is the electrons within the atom that are responsible for chemical bonding. Specifically, it's going to be the unpaired valence electrons that can allow an atom to form a covalent bond. So in the representation down here, we can see how atoms are coming together to form molecules. So for example, we would have chemical bonds connecting the carbon and oxygen atoms within the carbon dioxide compound. Similarly, in water, we're going to have these intramolecular forces, or covalent bonds, same thing, connecting these individual atoms to make one single unit. So whenever you're talking about the connections within one unit or one molecule, one compound, we call these intramolecular forces. So as we've said, the chemical bond, which is an intramolecular force, is a connection between two atoms. So if those two atoms are sharing electrons to have this connection, then we call that a covalent bond. Whereas if one atom is donating an electron that is accepted by another atom, we call that ionic bonding. And in the process of forming the ionic bond, both atoms are actually being converted into ions. So we've got these two different ways we can form chemical bonds, and in theory, two different ways you can have intramolecular forces which are forming within a particular group of atoms. So for covalent bonding, the covalent bond is a type of intramolecular force because all intramolecular forces are the bonds that hold together a particular group of atoms. And we know that the covalent bond is allowing two atoms to connect by sharing a pair of electrons. So one atom contributes one of these electrons and one atom contributes the other. So that's what we can see in this representation down here. The covalent bond between hydrogen and oxygen. The hydrogen is contributing one unpaired valence electron and the oxygen is contributing the other unpaired valence electron. Same on this side, which allows the formation of two covalent bonds, which you can show in this simplified representation where we have lines representing the covalent bonds between the oxygen and hydrogen atoms. And remembering why we form these covalent bonds to begin with, it's basically so the atoms involved can have full valence shells, so they are stable. And because the shared electrons count towards the total for both atoms, that means the hydrogens in this case would have 2, which is a full shell for them because they only have one shell, and the oxygen atom would have 8 valence electrons, which satisfies the octet rule and makes the oxygen stable as well. So we can see that there. Within the water molecule, if we count the electrons, oxygen would have 8 valence electrons and each hydrogen would have 2. So just to review some of the characteristics of the ionic bond now. So this is another type of our intramolecular force, ways that the groups of atoms can come together. But when these atoms come together, they actually turn into ions. So you have one metal ion giving away an electron to become more stable in terms of its valence electron shell, and a non-metal will gain the electrons that are lost from the metal atom. So this causes both of the atoms involved to become ions. So the metal, which is on the left-hand side here, will become a positively charged ion. Sodium's in group 1 of the periodic table. Group 1 and 2 are metals. And chlorine is the non-metal in group 7. So once they adopted this arrangement, they both have stable valence shells because the valence shells are full. Alright, so now we've reviewed the types of chemical bonding, which remember are the intramolecular forces. Let's focus more on the intermolecular forces. So these are the handshakes between multiple different people. At a molecular level, these are the attractions between different molecules. Okay, so different water molecules, for example, are going to be attracted to each other, and the attraction is via these intermolecular forces. So you might hear intramolecular forces being described as an electrostatic force, and this is true because essentially it's relying on an attraction between part of one of the molecules that is a bit more positive and another part that is more negative. So that's where the electrostatic definition comes in here. But remember, the intermolecular forces are not true chemical bonds, so nowhere near as strong as covalent or ionic bonds. So essentially, the more intermolecular forces there are within a group of molecules, the closer they're going to be held in together. Okay, so you can think of the intermolecular forces as a force that's basically holding molecules close together. So the closer together the molecules are, the more intermolecular forces there are. The further apart they are, the less intermolecular forces there are present in your sample. So later on, we're going to be relating this to our different states of solid, liquid, and gas, and look at the relative amounts of these forces that basically hold the whole thing together. So in general, a solid will have a lot of these intermolecular forces because the solid is made up of atoms and molecules that are very tightly packed. Hence, all the atoms are close together. Whereas a gas is the opposite. Very few intermolecular forces because the molecules and atoms are so far apart from each other. So as I said in the introduction, we've got 3 types of these intermolecular forces, but we're only going to be looking at the hydrogen bond in detail.